Hey guys, it's Shira from Woodshop Diaries, and the people have spoken, and I have finally decided to answer. For the last 6 months or so, I've had a lot of requests, like a lot more than usual, for some beginner epoxy projects. Now, I'm not a huge fan of epoxy projects because resin just isn't my favorite medium to work with, so I ignored these requests for a while, but this week I finally broke down and decided to give it a go again. Now, I say again because these are not my first epoxy projects. I've actually done a few in the past, and I just wasn't super happy with how they turned out, so it's been a while since I worked with resin. The problem that I have with epoxy projects is that I really like using clear epoxy, and it's just hard to get it to look very nice after you sand it. So this time I tried something a little different. I actually got this battery-powered polisher to use on my truck because it needs some work. But I thought after all of these epoxy requests, maybe I should give this a go and try it with resin. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing some simple epoxy project ideas, sharing some tips on my experience using it in the past and what I did differently this time that made a huge difference in the final result. This will be a relaxed, somewhat experimental project video, and I really hope you guys enjoy watching it. So if you're ready to get epoxying, let's go.
This video was sponsored by my friends at the Home Depot as part of the Prospective program. You can get as creative as you want here, but I just did 2 basic resin pours, one clear and one black with mica powder. And I made what I'll call a charger plate and some coasters from both of them. You could add handles and make yourself a tray, use them as a little plant coaster, use them as display on your countertops, whatever your heart desires. To get started, I grabbed an old board that I've had in my shop for a while with a big crack in it. The color of this board was really beautiful, but with the big crack, I just couldn't use it for much, so I carried it over to the miter saw and cut off some pieces to use for this pour. If you don't have a big cracked piece of wood, you can cut some unique shapes using a jigsaw to fake a live edge or use plain boards. Feel free to get creative here. I cut these about 14 to 16 inches long, and the end pieces were already broken, but I split the second piece down the crack to get 2 pieces. Then I headed to my plywood scrap pile and sourced some pieces that I could use to make a couple of molds. I laid out my pieces and kind of figured out a good size for the mold, and then cut these pieces to fit together to make a little tray to pour into. The great thing about making your own molds from scraps is that you can make them any shape and any size that you want. But of course, if you didn't want to make your own molds, you can grab some silicone molds online as well. I sanded all the mold pieces so that they were nice and smooth, and also all the wood pieces that I'm going to be using in the pour. I made sure to remove all of the sawdust and dirt as well, as I don't want these like seeping into the resin once it's poured. Because the resin would stick to the wood, before assembling these molds, I did line the insides with Tyvek tape. The resin won't stick to that. Then I just screwed together the 2 molds using wood screws. And because this is plywood, I made sure to pre-drill everything so it didn't crack or split when I drove the screws. Once the molds were assembled, I used some clear silicone along the corners to seal the joints. This will just help prevent the resin from leaking out once it's poured. And now this brings me to my first beginner tip for working with resin. Make sure to pour at the right temperature. It was 20 degrees outside, so I brought everything inside to pour. I've learned the hard way in the past that temperature is a major part of a successful pour. The resin that you use will tell you specifically what temperature to pour at, but typically about 70 degrees is good. I set out some trash bags on my island to protect it, clamped my wood pieces into the molds, and prepared to pour. Because this board was about 5/8 inches thick, I used a deep pour resin formula. There are a lot of brands and options for pouring thick resin, but make sure that whatever you use is able to be poured as thick as your board. I mixed up a little according to the instructions, and this brings me to my second and third beginner tip for working with epoxy resin. The second tip is to follow the mix ratio according to the instructions. So if it's a 1-to-1 mix, make sure you're mixing 1-to-1, and if it's a 3-to-1, make sure you're mixing 3-to-1, etc. My third tip is to make sure and stir well. You need to stir well for 2 reasons. 1, the 2 parts need to mix together properly in order to cure correctly, but 2, if you leave your resin clear and you don't add any coloring, If you don't stir it up really, really well, you'll see the two different parts in your mix and it will look kind of cloudy in the end result. So to get your clear resin really, really clear, both parts need to be mixed together completely. This means minutes worth of stirring, not just seconds. Once I was convinced that I had stirred well, I poured it into the mold. Clearly this wasn't enough, so I mixed up more and added it on top. I filled this mold until the resin reached the top of the wood, then stopped. For the second one, I did the same thing, but before I poured, I added in some black mica powder. You can get this powder in any color, and you can also use alcohol ink or other methods to tint the resin to your desired color. The powder gives it a glittery look, which you may or may not like. Once they were poured, I waited a little bit to make sure nothing leaked at the corners, and then set these aside to cure for about 4 days. Once I was sure they were fully cured, I carried them to the shop and unscrewed the molds and removed the pieces. The sides came off really easily with a rubber mallet, but I used a chisel to kind of pop the bottom off. Now, this is the part that bothers me the most: sanding. Make sure to wear a dust mask, as resin dust is pretty rough stuff. I used a belt sander first to help level out the top surface, and then I moved to an orbital sander. I started with 80 grit and sanded the top and bottom. The clear resin will look white and cloudy, which always makes me kind of nervous. After 80 grit, I went over it again with 120, then 180, then 220, 400, and 600 grit. Sanding will take a while, but it's important to sand through each grit, removing as many scratches left from the previous grit as you can. Allow plenty of time for sanding. I only had sanding discs up to 600 grit, so I hand sanded using 800 grit after the 600. Now, before I started hand sanding, I wanted to make sure that I was only sanding what I needed to, so I trimmed this piece down. You can get as creative as you want with trimming your piece down, but I just trimmed my edges clean, then cut this into an octagon. You could leave it square, make it a rectangle, cut it in a circle, whatever. I actually cut my black resin piece into small squares to use as coasters, but I wanted the clear one to stay together as one larger piece. After it was cut to size, I dipped my sandpaper in water to wet sand it. I started with 800 grit and then moved to 1500 grit the same way. I just tried my best to remove as many little scratches as I could on both sides and the edges. And this brings me to beginner tips for working with resin 4 and 5. Never underestimate how long sanding is needed, and when you think you're done sanding, sand a little more. And also, it's helpful to place a blanket, an old towel, or a t-shirt underneath while you sand to prevent scratching the bottom side while you're working on the top. As you can see, I didn't do this, and now I'm telling you because I made that mistake. Once it was sanded to 1500 grit, I brought out the polisher. I didn't have a polisher when I did my previous resin project, so this is something that I did differently this time that I really think made a big difference in how bright, shiny, and clear this turned out versus my last attempt. This Ryobi dual action polisher comes with 3 pads: a cutting pad, a correcting pad, and a finishing pad. It has variable speed for optimal control and can be easily adjusted from 3000 to 7500 orbits per minute. It offers a removable adjustable handle for various grip locations and a lock-on switch so you don't have to hold the button continuously. The best part is that it's lightweight at only 3.75 pounds and it's cordless, so it doesn't wear out your arms with continuous use and you can move it around freely without having to worry with any cords. So I have this polishing compound, and obviously it's for vehicles. I have read that polishing compound for plastic is a good option here for epoxy. But this was just at the Home Depot when I was there and I just grabbed it. So I'm gonna try it out. I don't know that it's necessarily the best option for this, but it is an option. And so that's what we're gonna use, see what happens. I'm gonna start with the cutting pad. I'm gonna try this first and then work our way down. Added a little bit of compound each time, smeared it around some, and then turned on the polisher. I started it slow, then just increased the speed once the compound was distributed. If it didn't seem to be doing much, I added a little more compound, but not a whole lot. I worked my way through the different pads, polishing both sides, then when it was finished, I wiped it clean. You can see the shine on the surface here. I never got the desk legs on my past clear resin project to shine like that. They still looked pretty cloudy, even after 1500 grit sandpaper. To seal and protect it, I applied some wax finish over the wood and the resin and buffed it in. Now, for the black resin piece, I followed this exact same process, except that instead of making it one big project, I sanded it and cut it into smaller squares. I actually used the jigsaw and a laminate blade to cut one circle out, but then decided just to make the rest squares, so I wasn't wasting as much material. Before cutting it down into smaller pieces, I found it easiest to sand it as the larger piece first, then cut it down and polish them separately. And now they're ready to use. I'm actually really excited to have some little plant coasters to protect the surfaces that I set my plants on, and also to protect my desk from my coffee and teacups. I really hope if you're one of the many who have requested some easy beginner resin projects lately, that this has given you some helpful tips and ideas. Let me know in the comments what easy resin projects you'd like to see, or you would like to make yourself. Thanks so much for watching, friends, and until next time, happy building!